News of the Times, the Ardlamont mystery, murder, money, and the missing man. Welcome to News of the Times. In the long, blood-inked annals of Victorian crime, few cases wind more darkly through the corridors of wealth, deception, legal ambiguity, and emerging forensic science as the death of 17-year-old Windsor Dudley Cecil Hamborough. It is 1893, and in the remote woodlands of Ardlamont in Scotland, a young aristocrat lies dead from a gunshot wound to the head. The official story, a tragic accident during a day's hunting, but the questions begin almost immediately and soon spiral into one of the most sensational murder trials of the decade. At the centre of it all is Mr. Alfred John Monson, a tutor and companion to the young heir. Monson had mentored Hamborough for years, feeding, housing and preparing him for a military career, under the promise that upon reaching his majority, Hamborough would inherit a fortune and Monson would be handsomely repaid. But all was not as it seemed. Beneath the polished exterior of patronage and promise lay a tangle of debts, vanishing inheritances, and a policy worth far more than the boy himself. The inheritance, it turns out, was all but gone. The tutor as well was nearly bankrupt, and just days before the fatal shot, Monson completed payment on two generous life insurance policies totalling £20,000, with his wife as the beneficiary. Now, was it an accident or the calculated final move in a financial endgame? As the trial unfolds, a parade of expert witnesses take the stand, among them Dr. Joseph Bell, the Edinburgh surgeon whose powers of deduction would inspire the creation of Sherlock Holmes. His testimony, focused on the angle and nature of the wound, challenged the claim of accidental death and marked a turning point as forensic science began to challenge the long dominant assumptions of eyewitnesses, accidents and social standing. In today's episode, we examine not only the death of Windsor Hamborough, but also the systems around him, a Victorian legal machine caught between the old assumptions and new methods, and a murder mystery shaped as much by social position as by forensic proof. This is the Ardlamont murder, and the tangled case that tested Victorian justice, scientific ambition, and the cost of misplaced trust. And in today's end of segment for the particular story, we're looking at ghost rabbits. Now, you didn't know there was a thing like this, did you? From the fog-bound pages of Victorian folklore comes a curious tale of moonlight bravado and one deeply unwise attempt to shoot a ghost rabbit. What follows was not a clean kill, but a mystery of its own. Now, if this sounds like your idea of perfect, slightly macabre me time, do consider giving us a like, a subscribe if you haven't already, and perhaps even a share with your nearest rabbit enthusiast. You know the one. So settle in, warming drink in hand, a modest plate of nibbles. You deserve it, you know you do, and enjoy the show. In the late Victorian period, arrangements that would feel deeply unusual today were, in certain circles, entirely routine. Among families of rank or long-established name, especially those with old estates but dwindling fortunes, it was common for boys to be placed under the care of a private military tutor, and these tutors were not simply teachers. They ran small domestic establishments where a handful of young gentlemen lived as boarders, The tutor lodged them, fed them, drilled them, supervised their studies, and prepared them for the militia or the officer training colleges. And critically, these arrangements were often made on credit. A great many Old English families lived in the shadow of mortgages, unfavourable investments, or estates too large to maintain. Ready money was scarce, but status and future inheritance were valuable commodities. A reputable tutor might agree to take a boy on the understanding that payment would be made later, usually when the young man reached his majority and could access his inheritance, or when the family managed to refinance their estate. This was not seen as reckless behaviour. It was, in fact, part of the broader web of genteel Victorian finance, where lawyers, agents, moneylenders and tutors were accustomed to working around liquidity shortages in better families. Promises of future inheritance often served as a form of informal collateral, and for many tutors the arrangement was worthwhile. A promising young pupil could bring prestige, and the eventual payment was assumed to be secure. So when Mr. Hamborough Sr., short on cash but long on family name, sought a tutor for his son, it was entirely conventional for him to ask whether an army tutor might be willing to wait for his remuneration until the boy obtained his majority. To modern ears it sounds precarious. To Victorian ones it sounded like a practical solution, another example of how social class, financial strain, and educational ambition intertwined in everyday life. The Hamboroughs of Ardlamont, a family of name, land, and diminishing means. The Hamboroughs were not without status. Their name was old, their estate, Ardlamont in the Argyll countryside of western Scotland, was historic, and their lineage carried the kind of weight that still held doors open in late Victorian society. But beneath the surface, the family was teetering. Windsor Dudley Cecil Hamborough, the young man at the heart of our story, was the only son of Mr. Windsor Arthur Edwin Hamborough, who, like many of his class in the 1890s, found himself rich in title but increasingly poor in liquid capital. By the time the boy was a teenager, the family's financial position had become precarious. Mortgages hung heavy over the estate, and attempts to raise money through financial agents, life insurance schemes, and speculative arrangements had fallen short. His mother was said to be desperate for the boy to pursue an officer's career in the Grenadier Guards, but the money for a proper education simply wasn't there. And the relationship between father and son? It appears to have fractured as Windsor grew older. While the father was increasingly entangled in financial knots, the son had found structure, attention, and ambition under the care of Alfred John Monson. Indeed, it was said that Windsor flatly refused to leave Monson's care when pressed. The tutor was no longer just a teacher, he was a father figure, a mentor, and perhaps the only adult who had delivered on his promises. In contrast, the elder Hamborough was slipping into legal disputes, financial obscurity, and eventually distance. It is within this tense triangle, a failing estate, a favoured tutor, and a son caught between them, that the seeds of the Ardlamont tragedy began to take root. Alfred John Monson, the ambitious tutor with everything to lose. Alfred John Monson was at first glance an unlikely suspect, well-spoken, outwardly respectable, and connected through his mother to a distinguished Yorkshire family. He earned his living as a private military tutor, a modest but reputable profession in late Victorian England. He had taken care of the young Windsor Dudley Cecil Hamborough several years earlier, boarding, clothing, training and mentoring him without immediate payment. The arrangement was conventional among certain families. Monson would be compensated handsomely once the boy reached his majority, when an expected £40,000 worth of inheritance would finally come due. That value approximately £5.8 million in 2025. But the fortune was not what it seemed. Unbeknownst to Monson, or as some later suggested, discovered by him only when it was far too late, young Hamborough's inheritance was a hollow promise. The great sum that was meant to justify years of unpaid labour, debts and upkeep simply didn't exist. Whether Monson never investigated the matter or uncovered the truth shortly before the tragedy remains one of the central ambiguities of the case, and one with potentially fatal implications. If Monson realised the money would never materialise, then his sudden pursuit of substantial life insurance policies, £20,000 in total, completed just days before the shooting, takes on a different colour. Was he a desperate tutor trying to salvage his financial survival, or a man who, having seen his last hopes evaporate, devised another solution entirely? By the summer of 1893, Monson was drowning in debt. Household expenses had mounted well beyond his means, and he had borrowed repeatedly against a future payout that now looked increasingly mythical. The life policies taken out in his wife's name were the one asset that was suddenly real. The man once trusted to shape a young heir into an officer and a gentleman would soon stand accused of a far darker ambition: murder for profit. It began quietly, as such things often do, with a brief notice in the Scotsman mournfully announcing the accidental death of a promising young officer. From the Scotsman, the 14th of August 1893, Lieutenant Winslow Dudley Cecil Hamborough, 3rd West Yorkshire Militia, son of Major Hamborough of the same regiment, who accidentally shot himself at Ardlamont near Glasgow on the 10th inst. But it would not take long for doubt to settle over the official account. Just over 2 weeks later, the same paper reported a far more serious tone and scope of investigation, suggesting all was not as it seemed at the secluded Ardlamont estate. From the Scotsman, the 29th of August 1893, the Ardlamont shooting fatality. Yesterday, Captain Fraser, Chief Constable for Argyllshire, Mr. McNaughton, Deputy Fiscal for the county, and police officers from Gourock visited Ardlamont, Kyles of Bute, with the view of making further investigations regarding the sad death of Lieutenant Windsor Cecil Dudley Hamborough of the West Yorkshire Militia, who was shot dead whilst out rabbit shooting on the Ardlamont estate on the morning of the 10th. Mr. Hamborough went out about 6:30 to shoot in the plantation close to Ardlamont House. He was accompanied by Alfred John Monson, his guardian, and a Mr. Edward Scott, engineer from Glasgow, the latter going out to carry the game. Both Mr. Hamborough and Mr. Monson had guns. In going through the plantation, they separated, and in a few minutes Mr. Monson heard a shot fired. He called to Mr. Hamborough, asking what he had killed, but he received no reply. Running in the direction from which the shot was heard, Mr. Monson found Mr. Hamborough lying on his left side in a ditch, with a gunshot wound immediately behind the left ear. The wound, it is stated, did not appear to be such as could be accounted for by an accident, nor such as he could have inflicted upon himself, the shot having entered the back of the left ear in a horizontal direction. The deceased gentleman had a narrow escape from drowning on the evening prior to his death. Whatever lingering hopes there may have been for an unfortunate accident began to evaporate quickly in the Highland air. Public curiosity sharpened into suspicion, especially as further details of the scene emerged, not least the direction of the fatal shot, fired from behind the ear. There was also the matter of the near drowning the previous evening, and, increasingly, the financial entanglements between young Hamborough and his long-time tutor. And then came the arrest. What made it all the more astonishing was the man in question. Alfred John Monson, not merely a private schoolmaster, but a well-connected gentleman with ties to aristocracy. His mother, the Honourable Mrs. Monson, had served as lady-in-waiting to the Duchess of Edinburgh. Viscount Oxenbridge was his uncle, the late Dowager Lady Galway, his aunt. Now, this same man, 32 years old, married with 3 young children, stood accused on suspicion of murder. From the Scotsman, the 31st of August 1893, the Ardlamont shooting case. The arrest of Mr. Monson. Yesterday, Alfred John Monson, Ardlamont House, was arrested and conveyed to Inverary by the Argyllshire police. He was brought before Sheriff Sharp, charged with having, on the morning of the 16th August last, shot in a wood near Ardlamont House Lieutenant Windsor Dudley Cecil Hamborough, and had murdered him. Monson was apprehended early in the morning at Ardlamont by Chief Constable Fraser, after which a search of the accused's repositories was conducted by Sheriff Sharp, Fiscal MacCulloch and Deputy Fiscal Macnaughton, all of whom arrived at Inverary by the steamer along with the prisoner. Monson is a young man, 32 years of age, married with 3 of a family, and belonging to a well-known and highly connected Yorkshire family. Notwithstanding the fatality, the shooting party at Ardlamont went on as usual. Guests came and went, and even on Tuesday Monson was out shooting, accompanied by 2 police officers under whose surveillance he was, and 2 representatives of the Mutual Insurance Society of New York, with which company the deceased was insured for £20,000, an insurance that was effected a week previous to the death, and of which the deceased's father, Major Hamborough, it is alleged, was in entire ignorance. The man, Scott, who was present when the fatality occurred, has not yet been traced, but a warrant has been issued for his arrest. It is reported that in consequence of the inquiries which are being made, the body of Mr. Hamborough, which was taken for interment to the Isle of Wight, where his parents are residing, is to be exhumed. From the Scotsman, the 1st of September 1893, the Ardlamont shooting case. Mr. Monson before the sheriff. As stated in yesterday's Scotsman, Mr. Alfred John Monson, who was arrested and conveyed to Inverary on Wednesday on a charge of having, on the morning of the 10th of August last, in a wood near Ardlamont House, shot Lieutenant Windsor Dudley Cecil Hamborough and caused his death, was allowed at his own request to reserve any declaration he might have to make. Accordingly, Mr. Monson was brought before Sheriff Sharp in the courthouse yesterday forenoon. As customary, the declaration was taken by the sheriff and officials in private. Having made his declaration, Mr. Monson was again removed to his cell. For several days before his arrest, he was constantly watched by a constable in plain clothing. Although well aware of this fact, he seemed to regard it with indifference. Since his arrest, however, his demeanour has undergone considerable change, at his examination before the sheriff, he is said to have been visibly agitated. In his statement to the sheriff, Mr. Monson is understood to have adhered closely to his original account of how Hamborough met his death. The third man of the shooting party, the engineer Scott, who left Ardlamont soon after the occurrence, continues to be searched for by the police and the insurance company, but as yet his apprehension has not been effected. In view of the grave accusation against the prisoner, the wound in the deceased man's head will require to be examined by the Crown authorities and its position and character accurately determined, and for this purpose the body will have to be exhumed. About 6 yards distant from the place where Hamborough's feet were, there is a small tree growing, and a careful examination of the bark at about the height of a man's head shows a number of pellet marks. The young man's head was not disfigured by the scorching or burning of gunpowder. The whole affair continues to excite widespread interest in the West, and in view of the unsuspected and sensational turn of events by the arrest of Mr. Monson, further developments are eagerly awaited. At this stage, a recapitulation of the incidents leading up to Mr. Monson's apprehension will be of interest. Mr. Hamborough and Mr. Monson became joint tenants of the estate at Ardlamont between the Kyles of Bute and Loch Fyne. Regarding Mr. Monson's connections and antecedents, everyone in the district was at that time uninformed, and it is now known that he is the third son of the late Reverend Thomas John Monson, rector of Kirby under Dale in Yorkshire, his mother being a daughter of the 5th Viscount Galway. He was born in May 1860 and is a married man with 3 children. His wife and children were residing with him at Ardlamont. Mr. Hamborough was the eldest son of Dudley Albert Hamborough of Steep Hill Castle, Isle of Wight. He would have attained his majority early next year. He was a lieutenant in the 4th Battalion, the Prince of Wales' own Yorkshire Regiment, in which his father holds a commission as a major. On attaining his majority, the young man would come into the possession of a large fortune, stated to be over £250,000 sterling, under the will of the near relative by whom the money was left. Mr. Monson was appointed guardian or trustee to the young heir during his minority, and for the past 4 years Hamborough had resided with Monson. At Ardlamont, the two passed the time fishing and shooting, and so pleased was Mr. Hamborough with the estate that he had arranged to buy it and remain there as laird. The negotiations, however, for its purchase, which are stated to have been entered upon by Mr. Monson on behalf of his charge, do not appear to have been completed by the 10th of August, the day on which Hamborough met his death. A week previous to that, Mr. Hamborough had life insured his life for £20,000 with the Mutual Life Assurance Society of New York. When the insurance was being effected, it is said that the representatives of the company understood that the policy was to be assigned to Mr. Monson, and that on the subject there were 1 or 2 more interviews with Mr. Monson. The story goes that Hamborough was under pecuniary obligations to Monson, and that this arrangement was effected as a security to Monson till the young man should come into his fortune. The day after the tragedy, Scott, the third man, left Ardlamont and has not been heard of since, although for the past few days the police and the insurance company have been active in their search. Monson is reported to have volunteered the information that London was his destination. The policeman cautioned Scott that perhaps he had better remain till the Procurator Fiscal had completed his investigations. With this suggestion, however, Scott could not see his way to concur, and went, leaving an address at Glasgow, at which, on subsequent inquiry, he was not found, nor was anything known of him. The mystery surrounding the whole affair is intensified by Scott's disappearance, and as little is known about him, and so slight and indefinite is the description of him furnished to the police, that fears are expressed that he cannot now be traced. Ardlamont House yesterday presented a very deserted appearance, all Mr. Monson's guests having departed immediately after his arrest yesterday morning, while Mrs. Monson and her 3 children, accompanied by Mr. Stephen, the factor of the estate, left for Inverary last night in the steam yacht which belonged to the deceased. The people residing in the immediate neighbourhood seem still inclined to favour the belief that Lieutenant Hamborough's death was purely accidental. The third man. The complexion of the Ardlamont shooting mystery remains unaltered. Mr. Monson is still in prison at Inverary, and the authorities continue their search for the third man, Scott, whose evidence is of such consequence at the present juncture. In and about Inverary, the tragedy is the subject of general conversation, and theories are rife as regarding the manner in which Hamborough met his death. Scott's part in the whole affair is shrouded in mystery, and nothing is known by the people in the district to where he came from, what his antecedents were, what his occupation was, what relations existed between him and Monson and Hamborough, and how long he had been known to either. Although reported to have been employed in the position of engineer on board a small steam yacht of Hamborough's, it is stated that he lived with Monson and Hamborough on terms of perfect equality and sat at table with them. His appearance did not resemble that of a workman. A statement which deepens the mystery surrounding the relations of the missing man with the occupants of the mansion house at Ardlamont is to the effect that neither the gardeners who removed Hamborough's body into the house nor the lead gamekeeper ever saw him. Additional investigations were being made and precognitions taken at Ardlamont yesterday, and several branches of a tree close to the place where Hamborough's body was found were cut down as productions of the case. These branches are said to bear the marks of having been pierced by pellets. Monson's financial house of cards. By the summer of 1893, Alfred John Monson was under intense financial strain. Although outwardly respectable, he was, in truth, a man drowning in debt. Just a year earlier, he had been declared bankrupt, with legal records showing years of borrowing, failed investments, and desperate attempts to stay afloat. His accounts showed liabilities exceeding £500, value approximately £72,500 in 2025, and his assets, such as they were, had largely been pledged or seized. Behind his genteel image as a private army tutor was a pattern of living far beyond his means. Monson had leased grand properties in his wife's name to avoid creditors, funded his household by borrowing against future tuition payments, and sold off what little he owned, even his furniture and horses. He had invested and lost heavily in a failed farm venture. He was also entangled in complicated contracts involving estates and life interests worth tens of thousands of pounds. On paper, he had once claimed a surplus of over £6,000, but much of this had vanished in legal costs and high interest loans. It would also come out several months later that Monson was a gambler. He liked the horses. This part-time was kept secret, and did not come out into the open until several months later. At the centre of this fragile financial structure stood Windsor Dudley Cecil Hamborough. Monson had taken on Hamborough not just as a pupil, but as a long-term investment. He boarded, clothed and educated the young heir for years without payment, on the understanding that a substantial sum, reportedly £40,000, would be paid to him once Hamborough came of age and received his inheritance. If that inheritance failed to materialise, so too did Monson's last and only lifeline. On the 5th of September, the body of Hamborough was exhumed for further medical examination, drawing a large and excitable crowd to the churchyard. Forensic experts conducted a second post-mortem, during which photographs were taken of the wound. Crucially, they reported no singeing around the skin, indicating the fatal shot was likely not fired at close range. Some pellets lodged in the skull and others had torn through the head, carrying away a portion of the ear. This detail, subtle but vital, cast growing doubt on the idea of a simple act. From the Scotsman, the 6th of September, 1893, the Ardlamont mystery. Interest in the Ardlamont mystery, which had been flagging somewhat for lack of new incident or information, was revived with intensity today by the accounts of the exclamation and examination of Mr. Hamborough's body. 3 theories are put forward as to how he came by his death. These are that he may have accidentally shot himself, that he may have been accidentally shot by Mr. Monson or by Mr. Scott, or that he may have been wilfully killed. The warrant upon which Mr. Monson was arrested and is still detained charges him enter the last of these alternatives. Search continues to be made, but unsuccessfully, for the third man, Mr. Scott. Although nothing further officially transpired, the general result of the post-mortem is an open secret in the town. The investigation is understood to indicate that the fatal shot was fired no nearer than 14 paces, the pellets spreading considerably, inflicting a wound extending in an almost horizontal direction from the base of the brain to the centre of the ear. Lieutenant Cecil Hamborough did not meet his death by his own carelessness. While financial revelations in London painted Monson as a man teetering on the edge of ruin, with debts mounting, estates in limbo, and his investment in young Hamborough verging on collapse, events back in Scotland took a darker, more physical turn. At Ardlamont, weeks after the shooting, a grim and unsettling discovery was made. A fragment of Lieutenant Hamborough's skull, marked with pellets, found perched atop the very wall near where his body had allegedly fallen. The find raised immediate and troubling questions. Had the body been moved? Could the angle of the fatal shot have been misinterpreted? And above all, was this really an accident at all? The implications of the skull fragment, its position, the pellet marks, the belated discovery were too serious to ignore. The questions it raised could no longer be waved away as idle speculation. The case, once thought closed, was clearly anything but. And so, amid growing scrutiny, the prosecution took an extraordinary step. From the Pall Mall Gazette, the 30th of September, 1893, the assistants of Sherlock Holmes. The correspondents who have written regarding the Ardlamont mystery, suggesting that now was the time for Sherlock Holmes to show his prowess, are probably not aware that Dr. Joseph Bell of Edinburgh, who has been engaged for the prosecution, is the prototype. Conan Doyle himself has told us that when he wrote his stories, he had a Dr. Bell in mind, and that the redoubtable Sherlock is an elaborated version of the Edinburgh physician. The Doctor has visited the tragedy, and his evidence in the eyewitness box at the forthcoming trial, which has now been definitely determined, is to be held in Edinburgh and will doubtless be a unique display of deductive reasoning. A legal struggle over the dead. As questions mounted in the press and prosecution, a separate battle quietly began behind the scenes, a struggle over the insurance money. Major Hamborough, himself deeply in debt, formally notified the Mutual of New York that he, not Mrs. Monson, would be claiming the two £10,000 policies taken out on his son's life as his son's direct beneficiary. Letters of administration were swiftly sought, and a caveat was lodged. Informal claims trickled on from creditors, distant relatives, and others who saw an opportunity in tragedy. Even as investigators sought answers about how the young lieutenant died, new tensions unfolded over who would profit from now that he was gone. An earlier attempt, the indictment is served. On the 20th of November 1893, the case took a decisive and dark new turn. The Pall Mall Gazette reported that an official indictment had been served on Alfred John Monson, now imprisoned in Edinburgh's Carlton jail, along with the still missing Edward Sweeney, also known as Davis or Scott. The charges were twofold. First, that Monson and Scott had attempted to drown Lieutenant Hamborough in Ardlamont Bay on the evening of the 9th of August, and second, that having failed, they had murdered him the following morning, shooting him in the woods near the house. Attached to the indictment was a vast list of witnesses, 110 names in total, and nearly 300 productions of evidence. Among them, the now infamous rowan tree, a fragment of skull, and a portion of a boat. The mystery was no longer a matter of speculative column inches. The Crown had committed to prosecution, and their case was being laid in full. Elsewhere in the papers, a pattern emerges. While preparations for Monson's murder trial continued in Edinburgh, the Pall Mall Gazette, now firmly embedded as the most relentless voice in the press, reported on a troubling new civil matter involving Monson's finances. Earlier in the year, Monson had attempted to raise money against the future inheritance of his wife, specifically the sum she was to receive upon the death of her mother, Mrs. Day. The loan was initially denied by the Lancashire and Yorkshire Revisionary Interest Society unless Mrs. Day's consent could be obtained. Shortly thereafter, that consent was apparently secured, at least on paper. But when interest payments lapsed and the society contacted Mrs. Day directly, she declared that she had never signed any such document. Legal proceedings followed, with Monson now in a Scottish prison and the murder trial looming. He could not be compelled to travel south to appear in court. Still, the Gazette seized the moment to cast yet another shadow on Monson's already dubious financial dealings. No formal connection to the Ardlamont affair was made, but in the eyes of many, a portrait of characters was beginning to form. The trial at Edinburgh, science, suspicion, and the shadow of doubt. Under Scottish law, serious criminal trials such as this proceed directly to the High Court of Judiciary, with no committal hearing as would be expected in England. Public interest in the Ardlamont case reached a fever pitch when the trial of Alfred John Monson opened before the High Court of Judiciary in Edinburgh. Inside, Scotland's most senior legal minds gathered to hear the Crown's case. Outside, crowds formed in hope of glimpsing the man at the heart of a mystery that had gripped the nation. Monson appeared pale but composed. He pleaded not guilty. As expected, the elusive Scot, now formally outlawed, did not appear. Mapping the scene. A civil engineer detailed the site where Lieutenant Hambrough's body was found. Pellet marks on the rowan lime and beech trees aligned with a clear opening in the wood, an opening 15 feet from the body. This suggests the shooter had stood in plain sight, not in the ditch and not atop the wall, as Monson had claimed. Meanwhile, multiple estate workers testified that the body had been lying on top of the wall, not in the ditch. No signs of blood or drag marks were found below. One gardener traced trampled grass leading away from the scene, implying the body may have been moved after death. Take 2. The night before. The court also heard about the boating accident the night before the shooting. A hired boat, witnesses said, had a knife made hole, not one caused by rocks or wear. The owner was adamant his boat had no plug holes, and certainly not in the place where the hole was found. It looked increasingly like a staged drowning attempt. The morning of the incident, several witnesses saw Monson and Scott walking together with 2 guns on the morning Hambrough died. Hambrough, by contrast, had gone in the opposite direction. One tourist stated plainly that they had continued as seen. They could not possibly have crossed paths before the fatal shot. And when questioned, Monson reportedly indicated multiple locations where he claimed the body had been lifted, none of which matched the actual spot. As the court listened, a picture emerged of a story full of inconsistencies. Science takes the stand, but it was the expert witnesses who delivered the most damning blows. The prosecution presented testimony from some of Britain's foremost experts on forensic science, including Scottish surgeon Joseph Bell, the very man who inspired Sherlock Holmes. According to the published reports of Bell's testimony, he was unequivocal. I have not been able to make out any way by which the injury could have been done either designedly or accidentally by Mr. Hambrough himself. I have no doubt whatever that the wound was inflicted from behind in a direction almost horizontal. In plain English, Bell believed a shot from behind at close range could have caused the injury. Not a dropped gun, not an accidental misfire while climbing, and certainly not a self-inflicted wound. The court fell into silence. Forensics on trial. Bell's testimony was pivotal, not just for this case, but for what it represented. Here was forensic science, still in its infancy in the 1890s, being brought into court by one of its early champions. This wasn't guesswork or speculation, it was analysis, trajectory, muzzle distance, tissue damage, and gunpowder residue. His involvement gave the prosecution an air of modernity and authority, but it was not, in the end, enough. The verdict. After weeks of sensational testimony from conflicting witnesses, clashing medical experts, and the quiet but devastating words of Joseph Bell, the jury returned and retired to deliberate, and in true Scottish fashion returned with a not proven verdict. It was not that Monson was found innocent, just not proven. A uniquely Scottish outcome. Monson walked free, but not cleared. From the Ardrossan and Saltcoats Herald, the 29th of December, 1893, not proven, was the verdict in the Monson case against Ardlamont. Mystery remains a mystery still. No other verdict was possible or would, in the circumstances, have been right. The prosecution made out a strong case, but the murder in the absence of Scott was not so brought him to the panel as would have justified a verdict of guilty. On the other hand, there was much evidence produced that might well make a jury hesitate to give a verdict of complete clearance. Not proven certainly leaves a stigma upon the man tried, an injustice, it may be said, to an innocent man. But better this occasionally than that an innocent man should suffer for a crime for which he is not guilty, or that the guilty should escape. The mystery that would not die. The court had spoken, the case was closed, and, officially at least, nothing had been proven. Monson was free, the jury had filed out, the legal teams returned to their chambers. Scotland, it seemed, had moved on, but not everyone had let the story go. Back in London, the Pall Mall Gazette, who had covered the case with a fervour bordering on obsession, had not lost interest. In fact, they had become even more determined. While others filed away their notes and forgot the name of Ardlamont, there was still following the scent of the missing third man, the mysterious Scott. Where had he gone? Who was he really? And why, if he had nothing to fear, had he vanished the moment a young man died? And now, months after the verdict, the Gazette claimed the scoop of the century: the discovery and surrender of the missing man known as Scott, real name Edward Sweeney, right there in their own London offices. What followed was part journalism, part theatre, and part unapologetic victory for the Pall Mall Gazette, who now considered themselves the unofficial investigators of Ardlamont. But their scoop also raised serious legal questions, because under Scottish law, Sweeney wasn't merely a witness, he was an outlaw. The third man speaks. For months, the identity of the elusive third man, the so-called Scott, present on the day of Hambrough's death, remained unresolved, until, with great ceremony, the Pall Mall Gazette announced that they'd found him, not a mysterious engineer at all, but a hall porter from the Westminster Palace Hotel named Edward Sweeney. Sweeney, under the Gazette's careful legal watch, made a full series of statutory declarations, and what emerged was a portrait of Monson's carefully constructed charade. The two had met at the races. Monson, ever in need of money and appearances, told Sweeney he was soon to inherit a fine Scottish estate, Ardlamont, and insisted Sweeney come and visit as a guest. There was just one condition. He could not arrive as himself. Sweeney would instead be introduced as Mr. Scott, a boat engineer, to impress young Hamborough. For Sweeney it seemed harmless, a free holiday, a bit of country air, and no expectation to shoot or shine. But what unfolded next would place him at the centre of one of the most suspicious deaths of the decade. He recalled Monson proposing a night-time boat ride, overstuffing the vessel with nets and gear and urging Sweeney to join. Sweeney declined, uncomfortable with the idea of drifting out into the Scottish darkness on what sounded more like a fishing expedition than a pleasure trip. He watched the two men, young Cecil Hamborough and his friend and host Monson, row off into the black. Moments later he heard a shout. Then Monson came running up the beach, soaked and breathless, saying the boat had overturned. Hambro, also drenched, eventually appeared after. Sweeney thought a little of it at the time, but it was the next morning's rabbit hunt that changed everything. Woken early, Sweeney fell into line behind the others, a reluctant tag-along, not a sportsman, and certainly not there to shoot. Upon reaching the misty woods, Monson and young Cecil Hambro separated. Sweeney followed Monson, slowly lagging behind him, unused to early morning jaunts in bracing Scottish estates. And then came the single fatal shot. Sweeney didn't see it happen. He only saw Monson standing alone. Then they both discovered Hambro's body some 20 to 30 yards from where Monson had stopped. They carried the boy back to the house and called for a doctor. At that point, everyone assumed a tragic accident, and with his false identity dangling dangerously, Sweeney asked whether he needed to stay for the inquest. The doctor, unaware of any suspicion, told him no. So Sweeney vanished, and when the story exploded into scandal, he chose to stay hidden. According to his own words, he wasn't guilty, just in the wrong place, under the wrong name, at the worst possible time. As with so much of the Ardlamont mystery, the truth remains elusive. The prosecution brought in some of the most respected forensic minds in Britain, and yet, despite all the revelations, the insurance policies, the staged identities, the mounting debts, elaborate deceptions, the jury returned a verdict of not proven. Monson walked free. Hambro was clearly dead and clearly shot. There were suggestions the place where his body had been found had been staged. There were revelations about Monson's precarious finances and the extraordinary late-breaking news that young Hambro would not be receiving the vast inheritance everyone had assumed. Did Monson know this in advance? And then the arrival of the third man, brought in by Monson under a false name, for no stated reason beyond the fact that they had met at the track and Monson had liked him. 2 incidents, 2 chances for Hambro to die, one by sea, one by gun, and a convenient guest to witness neither properly. Under English law, would Monson have been found guilty? We'll never know. Sweeney, although eventually found, was never prosecuted, and Cecil Hambro remains to this day a mystery buried, a victim of either tragic accident or calculated ambition cloaked in respectability. Further particulars. Now, if you've been paying close attention, and I really hope you have, you may recall that the unfortunate Mr. Hambro met his fate during what was described as a rather routine rabbit shooting expedition. Now, we make no allegations regarding the supernatural. We leave that to the Victorians, who rarely missed an opportunity to spot a ghost in a damp field or a moral lesson in a thunderclap. But as it happens, a peculiar tale of another ill-fated rabbit hunt from the Cornish village of Eglerhale reached our desk this week, courtesy of a 19th century volume so marinated in folklore it practically drips with candle wax. And if you've ever thought to yourself, surely no one has ever died in an attempt to shoot a ghost rabbit by moonlight, well, dear listener, prepare to recalibrate your expectations. This, then, is the story of a Cornish pub, a full moon, and a rabbit with a death toll, though not its own. Highways and Byways of Devon and Cornwall by Arthur H. Norway, 1897. Ghost Rabbits. If I were otherwise, you might now see, but never say when the moon is bright, a white rabbit gambolling about this open space beside the churchyard wall, a pretty, long-eared rabbit with pink eyes like any child's pet escaped from its hutch. It goes loppeting about among the grasses by the corner of the marsh, and if any one should pass, will sit and look at him with fearless eyes, and well it may. It has nothing to dread from anyone dwelling in those parts. No villager would attempt to catch it, no boy would aim a blow at it. If anyone walking late sees the white rabbit lopping at his heels, he makes no effort to drive it away, but quickens his pace and hopes some good angel may stand between him and harm. A belated postman, terrified to find he could not shake off the pretty white creature at his heels, lost his head and turned and struck fiercely at it with his oaken cudgel. He felt the stick fall on the soft back of the rabbit, such a blow as might have killed a much larger animal, but the rabbit lopped on as if nothing had happened. The cudgel which was broken shivered into splinters as if it had struck upon a rock. No one can tell the history of the rabbit, but our grandfathers knew and feared it as we do ourselves, and it was in their time that the last deliberate effort to meddle with the creature took place. The attempt was made by a stranger, and it happened in this wise. A number of young men were drinking together in the bar room of the chief inn of the town. As the evening wore away, the talk grew high, and at last, when all the parties were heated, someone spoke of the white rabbit. Instantly the stranger began to jeer. A silly story, such as that would never be believed outside a poky country town, where nobody had anything better to do than to listen to the first idle tale told him. What harm could a rabbit do anybody? He would like nothing better than to shoot it. One of the others drew aside the shutter and looked out. The street was as bright as day, and overhead they could see the full moon sailing free of clouds. That's best go now, he said. When the moon shines like this, they'll find the rabbit by the church. A gun was hanging on the wall. It was taken down and loaded amid a babble of jeers and angry retorts, and then the party crowded into the door to watch the stranger stride down the moonlit street, whistling merrily as he went. They saw him pass upon the bridge and then went back to their bottles. But some strange feeling of uneasiness had settled over them. No one seemed inclined to sit down again. They moved restlessly about the room, and presently one of them went to the door and looked out. Others asked eagerly if he had heard anything, but though they knew the stranger could not have reached the church, and then one suggested that it was a shame to allow a man who had no knowledge of his danger to encounter it alone. The others agreed as readily as men will when they have done what does not please them, and without more delay they set off in a body. They trudged along, saying nothing, but when they came near the church they heard a report and a loud cry, and with one accord they ran to the open space with beating hearts. Neither man nor rabbit was to be seen. They ran up and down, calling his name. There was no reply. He was not in the lane, nor on the high road, nor on the marsh, where, under the bright moonlight, the motion of a waterhen could have been seen with ease. At last, one of the searchers leapt up onto the churchyard wall and sprang down on the inner side, calling on his friends to follow him. There they found him lying dead, with one barrel of his gun discharged and the contents buried in his body. Now that happened many years ago, but still the stranger may be seen leaning over the low wall, pointing an ancient flintlock gun at some object which moves quickly in the long grass. That concludes this episode of Haunting Rabbits, Questionable Crime Scenes, and Suspiciously Well-Dressed Hall Porters with Aliases. If your brain is now full of Victorian courtrooms, rowan trees, and boat accidents, you're not alone. If you've enjoyed today's tangled tale of ambition, misfire, and mysterious third men, please do all the hoop YouTube things. Like, subscribe, share, comment, or really just press any button that looks like it might help. And if you like even more curious cases, ad-free episodes and archival rabbit holes, you'll find all of that and more waiting over at our home, News of the Times, Historical Crime at patreon.com. This has been News of the Times, and I'm Robin Coles, Inspector-in-Chief of the velvet red-coated ferrets on duty here at our home base. We'll soon be back with another odd tale from the past. Until then, beware of free Scottish holidays.